How we doing, folks? It's Monday morning. I suppose if you're in Antwerp or Ankara, it's Monday afternoon, evening. And even more so if you're in Japan or Thailand or somewhere. There's a few of you guys out there watching from around the world. But happy Jazz Week to you guys. Interesting things going on with Cafe. We're seeing making some progress there. We'll know more by the end of this week, actually, if we actually can start doing things. So it's kind of exciting, but it's still taking way longer than I had hoped to get that underway. My wife did get another good job, which will definitely help things in our situation. Thank you for all your support. I'm still looking for work. Trying to track down a couple gigs from old friends at home places, but we'll see what happens. You know, it's a tough thing, and it's a tough market right now for restaurants, and so paying a DJ, especially a good DJ who wants to get paid, it's not easy right now, not an easy sell. But we're still persevering. You know, what can you do? We got to live your life, and don't settle. You got to be what you are. You know, this is what I do. Music's what I'm about. So we're hoping and praying the right thing comes along. So today I'm just going to do a simple thing. And I'm going to talk to you about a record I like a lot. I'd even say I love this record. And there's days I would wake up and say, this might be my favorite Miles Davis record. And there's other days I'd wake up and say, Kind of Blues is probably my favorite. I love 7 Steps to Heaven. I wouldn't say it's his best, but it's one of my favorites for sure. But this one might be quietly his best. And it finds him in a fairly comfortable setting. He seems confident. He seems mature. He doesn't seem like he's being overwhelmed by the young kids of this next group he's about to embark with, that has so many fresh ideas that I think he's struggling to even kind of stay above board at times. He holds his own. He's Miles Davis, but Wayne and Tony and Ron and Herbie, ideation is just pouring out of them. And Miles often feels like he's coming from a different context, speaking a bit of a different language. It's a bit like, for younger kids, how if a Snoop Dogg was going to rap with the Migos and a bunch of those trap kids, his flow would sound very different, more traditional, more of a natural rhythm and melodic phrasing versus the pulse and staccato and triplets of what the younger kids are doing. But Miles' first grade quintet has been dissolving here in the early 60s. There's some pressure from Columbia already to start matching the success of Sketches of Spain and Kinda Blue. And these things weren't easy to replicate that success. His numbers were doing fairly good, but Sketches of Spain and Kinda Blue sold 100,000 copies in their initial runs, which for jazz was unheard of at that point. And from what I've been reading at times, his numbers have been slipping somewhat back. And by the time you're doing 7 sketches and Carnegie, some of the other records in there, he's selling 40, 50, 60,000 copies. And there's a pressure from the label, but there's also a pressure from himself. Because, you know, your contract, your money, your stability, your safety, security, it's all kind of interwoven now in your success. And once you get to a certain level, you have to keep maintaining that level. And maintaining that level of creativity is very ominous. And I think it's something Miles struggles with. I think it's part of his depression, part of his anxiety, part of his almost a desperation you feel from him at times. It's trying to stay not just current, but lucrative. You know, trying to stay a moneymaker so that Columbia would continue to pay those contracts and bills, and he would continue to be a factor in an ever fast changing jazz scene in an even more rapidly changing music scene. And so Miles, I think, is obviously propelled by a lot of different forces into a myriad of sounds. And here we find him at the tail end of his first great quintet. And I'm a huge fan of that first quintet: Red Garland, Paul Chambers, Philly Joe Jones. And through Kinda Blue, that era, there's lineup changes. Cannonball Adderley comes in, Bill Evans is helping. Red Garland gets dismissed rather unceremoniously. Wynton Kelly steps in to be replaced by Bill Evans, only to have Wynton Kelly come back in. And so he's definitely in this new fluctuation of what's my next group going to look like. And there's an incredible list of people that come through the Miles Davis ranks in 60-61. You know, from Sam Rivers to Sonny Stitt to Victor Feldman. It just, the list goes on of greats that gave that seat a shot. There are also people who were asked who declined, because there's a rigidity to working under someone that in that mind state. You know, there's going to be certain limitations that are going to be the trade-off for the excellent payday. Some guys are willing to make that calculation. Other guys are going to be like, I don't think that's going to be for me. So Miles is kind of coming out of the great successes of his late 50s, early 60s career, and he's kind of staring down the barrel. And he's got Coltrane on board for a couple tracks. He's recruited a young Mr. Hank Mobley from Blue Note to assist him on this record. I believe Jimmy Cobb is now on the drums when Kelly's back in the piano chair. It's a different group, but it's still clinging to the sounds and traditions of that first quintet. And we're, of course, talking about Someday My Prince Will Come. And this is, for my money, one of the most satisfying Miles Davis albums. There's a looseness, a comfortability. There's old friends. The muted Miles Davis established sound at this point. It's a record that you can play on repeat a few times in your car and just ingest it. It's got wonderful tonalities. Like I said, there's a maturity. Miles hasn't quite reached the panic zone of the next few years of all the transitions, trying to find that next set of coattails that he needs to kind of cling to. Because Miles, for all of his greatness, has always had a star next to him. For two reasons. One, to help illuminate his own star. But secondly, he needs someone to play off of, to allow his minimalism to really have impact. Which is why Coltrane was such a great foil. That yin-yang, oppositions attracting. Coltrane was endless notes. And that was perfectly fine with Miles, because it allowed my limited scope to come in and breathe and feel even more like an open plane. And even on this track, when Coltrane comes in at the second half, the rhythm section picks up and goes double time and just starts filling in much more behind John. But with Miles, Wynton's just laying out, playing a little soft accompaniment. Paul's just plucking a little this here and there. It's wonderful, mature, modern jazz that, for all the definitions that exist in jazz, this is Miles doing just straight kind of modern jazz. And there's still some elements of modal, and there's still some elements of, you know, hard bop and some of the more up-tempo numbers. But remember, these names, these labels, they're things that are applied more by the critics than by the musicians themselves. They don't come into the studio and say, today I'm going to play a modal record and we're going to make a hard bop record tomorrow. They're just playing songs. And the definitions of what musicians are, it's very fluent. making these cards, I'm up to 440 now. And I'm going to stop at 600 for the initial sequence, and still figuring out the details with all that. But making these cards, I'm trying to give people an idea what genre these people are in. And there's really only several monikers that matter. If you're free avant-garde, you definitely need to have that warning sticker for new jazz fans to be aware this is going to be a little bit more on the outside. This was in a film this to be a dangerous part of the movie. You hear the band now. There's a whole lot more Jimmy Cobb coming in there. It's the art of not just matching the player, but matching the emotional state of the player and just knowing their personality. You know, when Coltrane comes in, you gotta put a little more punch in your a little more liquor in your punch. How about that? But doing the trading cards, it's really clear to me how most of the guys who played swing were capably able of playing modern, and most graphed themselves into modern, smaller groups in the 40s and 50s and 60s. There's not very many swing cats that weren't capable of playing in a smaller setting doing a different thing. The swing thing was more just arrangements that you had to learn, and then you did your solos and improvise in the spaces that were allowed for you. Stripping it down to a quartet or a trio in the studio, it just meant you had that many more bars to expand on your ideas. All these guys were capable of playing modern. So swing and modern, it's, bebop and hard bop are two of the clearest definitions in a way. Bebop really eschews the melody and the characteristic melody of a song. It kind of just abandons them and just uses the chords and the scales and just plays. And it's frenetic, and it can be very unfamiliar to the original, even what the song is. Hard bop gives a little bit more of that original song back. And again, hard bop for me is as defined by the emotional input into it as it is by its tempos. There's plenty of up-tempo stuff from many different players that doesn't have the tension and the aggression and the resistance that makes hard bop what it is. And that's what I've been calling cool bop. For those of you who are kind of new to the channel, cool bop is up-tempo as snot, swings like crazy, but there's just a guttural tension, aggression, frustration that's not as present in those guys. And it's mostly related to the fact that their lifestyles are different. And it's not purely a black and white thing, but it definitely has a lot of those lines being drawn. But a lot of the swing cats could play well into the 50s and 60s doing modern stuff. And there's so many ways to define modern. Post-bop kind of means modern. Third stream has classical elements woven into it, but you could also say it's a modern. There's a lot of elements in jazz that you could just simply describe them as swing or modern. Bebop, hard bop, free avant-garde, and you don't really need to have infinite dissections beyond that. And most cats are able to play modern. And even most of the modern kids, even the hard bop, bebop kids, were able to play in swing bands because that's where most of them came from. These were the big proving grounds. These were the places where you learned to be star talent. And those guys who became star talent became a part of the new present and part of the new modern sounds. It took a certain militancy from a younger set to make hard bop happen. It's not something that the most no one I think ever went to the studio and said, I'm going to make a hard bop record, black or white. And even the most militant black players, the label is something that the writers at that time just felt this had a little edge to it that's different. It wasn't bebop anymore, but it wasn't just straight modern small group sessions. There was a little something extra in that mix. But the average hard bop record has a blues and a ballad, which the average post-swing player record also has a blues and a ballad. So it's jazz is always kind of modern in a way. And we even, like I saw with that Sam Jones record on last episode, even in the bebop, hard bop, modern era. These cats got into bigger ensembles, and then you start to have more choreographed, arranged parts that throws back to the swing era. So jazz is all very interchangeable, and I'm going to borrow something from that. I'm going to use a little bit of this, and even how the Dixieland stuff from down New Orleans way has elements of free jazz in it, with the frenetic directions of every player at once. It's an interesting thing. This gumbo that we call jazz. Wynton Marsalis, for me, is one of the great orators of jazz. I loved him in the Ken Burns documentary. It's getting time. I think I need to watch that again, because there's just so much great history in it that I can soak up and really find insight and share things from. But and there's a lot of people out there who hate that documentary. I really kind of balk at that notion. There's a lot more value in there than there is to be criticized. But that being said, someday my prince will come. When I was driving Lyft and Uber, this was something that was in my CD player. Sometimes for a week, I would just have it in there. Same with Seven Steps to Heaven. Same with Round Midnight. Those records, I think, are just kind of blue. Would stay in there for a week at a time. Oddly enough, the Gil Evans arranged stuff, which has a real serenity to it, also has a very bright, trebly, Spanish, dusty sounding, high arranged brass brightness that in a car you just want to open the windows. It's so bright. Digitally, it's just so in your face that I found a lot of the Gil Evans sweeping bright sounds to be horrible in the car. Honestly, I prefer them much more in the warmth of vinyl. Digitally, I find even Miles' trumpet can be very piercing and nail through the head. And that's just the dynamics of digital sound in a car. You know, I had to peel the trebles and mids out so often, and then you're rolling around listening to Paul Chambers play, which ain't all bad either. But my friend Cale Taylor, who's messaged me a lot over the last 6 months, just learning the jazz and asking me questions, and I've enjoyed chatting with him. It was fun to see how much he got it the other day. He was talking about Hank Mobley's Roll Call and how he doesn't like it as much as some of the other Hank Mobley records he's got, because it was so dissonant and edgy and very bright and up-tempo. And the fact of the matter is, that record's largely informed by Art Blakey and Freddie Hubbard. And Mobley's more of a guy who grafts himself to who he's around, not letting people graft themselves to him. We've often said that about Mobley. And so when you bring those two into that session, it's as an aggressive and as bright and edgy a record as Mobley does in some ways. It's a pretty intense slice of Hank Mobley's career, and it's surrounded by records like Soul Station and Workout, which have different lineups and are much more melancholy and moody and bluesy. And if you take Workout with Wynn Kelly and Grant Green, and just a different set of soloists, it's a much more, and it was clear illustration to even a pretty young jazz fan how much personality can change the direction of an artist's record. The sound of that record is informed by personality, by the players that are making it. And so the notion that the people who are making it doesn't matter, and the race doesn't matter, and the experience of those people doesn't matter, it's ridiculous. It's not just about the notes. It's not just about the virtuosity and the science and the math of composition. It's absolutely about the tonal expression of people's souls coming across through the numbers and the math and the music. And if you're not hearing the personalities and how that's inflecting and changing the sound of different records and different sessions, I think you're missing so much of the picture. So I digress. Miles has an apex for me. And it's really 55 through 1961, 62, where Miles is really at his pinnacle of his career in my ears. And I do enjoy the second quintet a lot. But again, those to me almost aren't even Miles Davis records. Those are way shorter records. And there's large sections where Miles is sitting out on a lot of those tracks. when I'm thinking about what Miles' sound is and what Miles does, it's this era here, this early Columbia work, where Miles is truly, I think, doing what Miles is. And I don't think there's any question when Miles is doing what he's doing in the 70s and the 80s. He's, again, just trying to seek the revenue that justifies him keeping a contract. You know, when you're experimenting with hip-hop, you know that you're on the end of your artistic license. You need to borrow from other people's inspirations to maybe give yourself another window into the commercial markets with younger audiences. You see musicians all the time grafting the new thing, trying to stay legitimate, to stay current for a long stretch of time in R&B and hip-hop and rock and pop. It's really hard to be Aerosmith, and they even faded for a long time. It's really hard to be Metallica, and they faded during the Nirvana grunge days for some, during most of the 90s. To be something that maintains credibility for a long time, like an Usher, it's hard. Chris Brown, in spite of all of his, issues with women and the law, the kid can dance and the kid can sing, and so Chris Brown has managed to be. It was funny, as kids coming up today think of Chris Brown as being old school. He goes back to 2000. R. Kelly now is obviously a piece of the past and he's done. But I remember R. Kelly making records that were completely different records in early 2010s, 2011s, trying to reach those new kids. Because kids kind of drive what's cool, sadly. It's 14-year-olds who are telling the marketplace this is what the new sound's going to be. It's Taylor the Creator and all the young kids and what they decide is going to be selling. It's what you have to even play in the bar for the 23-year-olds. It's kind of a weird thing how the industry's so set up around that nowadays, for sure. But anyway, it's an amazing music, this jazz. And I gotta try to find a way to be able to speak to the new people in jazz and excite them and bring them down this path. Once in a while, anyway, to do stuff for new people and still keep my older subscribers and followers interested. If I do a few episodes for beginners once in a while, what's the best way to try to graft some veteran intrigue as well into that subject matter? That's something I've been kind of thinking about. And I think I do it pretty well, where I can do something that beginners can watch at times, and even someone who's been listening to jazz for years can still find, oh, that was interesting. I like that insight, That's a challenge at times. And I think too often my channel is very targeted towards more experienced, deeper jazz heads. Talking about Bethlehem and Savoy and labels that are beyond the grasp of the beginner jazz fan. And I think I need to bring the newer jazz fan in more. But are my old subscribers going to tune into a channel where I'm talking about Kinda Blue? We only need to talk about that so often. And I can only talk about it so often, even though I think it's a fantastic record. But anyway, so that's just it today. I love Someday My Prince Will Come. And you can feel how different it is even here when Coltrane's doing this thing. And there is really little else in jazz as beautiful and as contemplative as the muted harmon mute of Miles Davis. It's just got a real cerebral warmth. It's in some ways one of the things that really Siren Call lured me into jazz was these records where Miles becomes a master of that mute. And you can really make it a case that Miles doesn't really know who he is until he discovers that mute. And it became so his sound that other players shied away from using that mute. That's the harmon mute was like, oh, I don't want to sound like Miles Davis too much. And so cats would reluctantly use it at times. And I do believe Sweets Edison kind of was actually more of an originator on the mute. I could be wrong, but I know Sweets was one of the real originators of muted trumpet. Whether or not it was a harmon, I can't remember. But Sweets is some guys, he's a real lineage guy that people need to check out more. when you work with Sinatra, when you work with Billie Holiday, when you're working with Ben Webster, when you're working with Count Basie, Sweets Edison is a real giant and one of the great trumpet players. He has some fantastic records out there that'll help introduce you to what Sweets Edison was about. And there's no question that Miles Davis was greatly influenced by Sweets Edison, you know. So anyway, that's right. I'm going to wrap today's episode up here. Got some fun stuff coming down the pike. And me and Ken are going to make another episode sooner rather than later, I think. That was such a fun time. And one of the great things I liked about that format was just the questions were more just kind of starting places, and they went where they went. But I think the banter, because the questions were what they were, there was a real elemental approach to even the beginner being able to follow a lot of that stuff. It wasn't like it was above everyone's head, deep philosophical, you know, ramifications of the jazz quality. Like it wasn't deep. It was fun on the surface, educational but light. It wasn't a heavy jazz session of intellectual. It wasn't that. It was very light and fun, and a format that I think even non-jazz fans could probably listen to that and be like, "Oh, that was pretty fun, pretty interesting." And me and Ken's dynamic, I think, is a nice balance. I'm a fairly flamboyant, charismatic person. He's a little bit more subdued and doesn't move as much as I do. I'm hoping to get my microphone to sound a little better this time. I was a little bit too far from my phone. So the content was good though, so we couldn't just go delete it all, you know. But anyway, some of it was just the nature of the Zoom call as well. So cheers to everybody. Have a great day. We'll talk to you all soon, and I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Peace.